North Korea has fired a missile from the Sunan district of Pyongyang. The unidentified projectile traveled east, according to Japanese media. Japanese citizens in several prefectures were warned to find shelter following reports that a missile was airborne, adding that the missile probably flew over Japan's island of Hokkaido. Our correspondent in New York, Caleb Maupin, has more.
We have heard at this point that the missile has touched down in the Pacific Ocean. At this point, they're calling it an unidentified missile, as the type of missile, exactly what type it was, has not clearly been confirmed. We don't exactly know what type of missile it was. We do, according to the South Korean military, the missile was launched from Pyongyang. Nearby Pyongyang, there is an area in which the Pyongyang International Airport is located. That's called Sunan. That was apparently the site from which the missile was launched. Now, this comes in the aftermath of September 3rd, in which North Korea carried out its sixth nuclear test, the most powerful of its nuclear tests. And many are suspecting that this is a response to the United Nations Security Council. Recently, there were new sanctions imposed on the DPRK at the UN Security Council. North Korea promised a response. This is being seen by many people as that response. Now, we are getting some new details about the missile itself. At this point, we're hearing that the missile was traveling. It actually traveled a total of 2,300 miles. That's 3,700 kilometers before falling into the Pacific Ocean, and that it reached an altitude of 480 miles into the sky. It's interesting to note the distance that the missile traveled is actually far enough to reach the U.S. territory of Guam. That has been a concern. There's been talk of the possibility of Guam being hit by a missile or being attacked by North Korea, and we do have confirmation that this recent missile that flew over the Japanese island of Hokkaido actually did travel far enough that it was within the length and distance than the U.S. territory of Guam. So that's an interesting angle and an interesting detail. It is interesting to note. Now, as of yet, we are still waiting to hear what type of missile this was. It's being called an unidentified missile. Was it an ICBM? Was it just a continental missile? What kind of missile was it? We're also hearing from South Korea. The president of South Korea has called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss this recent launch. So we're here in New York. There's been activities at the UN today. So all eyes are on the United Nations to see what the Security Council will do next, with the General Assembly in full swing here in the month of September, with the big week, many world leaders speaking in the following week. So this is quite a time for an action like this to take place. All eyes are on the United Nations and on the Korean Peninsula.
In response, the South Korean military conducted a ballistic missile exercise of their own, launching a Hyunmoo-2 projectile off the eastern coast. This comes after yesterday South Korea tested a long-range missile as a response to what they perceive as the threat posed by North Korea. Now, the Taurus missile is capable of reaching Pyongyang and all of North Korea. South Korea has also recently been holding drills with the U.S. in the face of 6 nuclear weapon tests by North Korea. Now, the test comes after the UN adopted a U.S.-drafted resolution to impose new sanctions on North Korea on Monday. RT's Anya Parampo is in Seoul and brings us the latest.
So far today, Pyongyang did test an unidentified missile directed towards the east, apparently crossing within Japanese airspace. And in reaction, Seoul has called for emergency meetings at the UN Security Council and has fired off its own test missiles in response. But I should note this isn't the kind of news which necessarily rattles people, the average people here in Korea, simply because they've been basically in a permanent state of war with the North since 1953, and the division of Korea being solidified through the Korean War and the establishment of a permanent U.S. military presence here in South Korea. There are 15 U.S. military bases, but it should also be discussed the fact this week there were many escalations leading up to this point. We saw unprecedented sanctions passed at the United Nations targeting North Korea's second largest industry. That's, of course, the textile industry. And we also actually witnessed an opposition delegation of lawmakers from Seoul in the Liberty Korea Party travel to Washington and make a request for tactical nuclear weapons to be deployed to the south. I actually interviewed the head of that party, Mr. Lee Chol-woo, about his trips to Washington before he left, when he said he'd be meeting with several policy advisors to Trump as well as members of Congress to make the case. But very significantly, yesterday, President Moon Jae-in in Seoul ruled that out as an option, saying the introduction of tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea would only inflame an arms race here on the peninsula. But as we can all see, that arms race is already in full swing as these tests continue to rattle off from the north. It's evident sanctions and flaunting military gear from the United States, as South Korea did this week, is not going to deter defiance from the north anytime soon. So we can only expect to see a continuation of these escalations unless some sort of a diplomatic solution is put in place, or at least the wheels of which start to roll.
All right, lots to cover in this situation. It's a little bit more than just saying Kim Jong-un be cray. Let's now cross live to Dr. Simone Chun, member of the Korea Peace Network, the UN Security Council. They're meeting right now in they're supposedly getting ready to meet for an emergency session called for by South Korea. They're going to hold consultations on the DPRK's latest missile launch. Lots to cover here. What do you think the outcome is going to be, considering they just passed a resolution this week on the resolution?
I think that there's going to be any new development. I think that for some time we're going to see the same pattern, that is a sanctions and also sanctioned regime led by United States and also UN, and also supported by, unfortunately, South Korea and Japan and other allies. And in response, I believe that North Korea will continue to this missile and also, if not, the nuclear programs. So I don't think any major new development unless there is any consensus on diplomacy and making clear policy shift. As you know, 71% of Americans, whether Republican or Democrats, support diplomacy, and also more than 80% of South Koreans support diplomacy, immediate diplomacy with North Korea. So I think that the most important variable will be public pressure.
So U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis has called the latest missile launch a reckless act by the North Koreans. You can expect that type of rhetoric from Washington. But what can we expect in terms of an actual action? We know that diplomacy hasn't been working. We know that the DPRK doesn't really care about sanctions, that the sanctions don't really work except for harming the people there in the country. Do you think that a military response is possible, considering this latest provocation?
I think the military response is viable, but I think the United States will continue to, if not real action, will use harsh rhetoric, and also Japan as well. And so I think that what's going to happen in the next few weeks, or if not month, we'll see the same pattern. But I do think that there is a very incredible public and also international pressure for diplomacy. As you know, Russia and China strongly support double freeze, that is the North Korea freeze, it's a missile and nuclear existing programs. In exchange, United States reduce hostility. And I think that is a very viable approach. And also, as President Jimmy Carter pointed out, eventually North Korea and also all, many people want peace treaty as a final solution. But to answer your question, I don't think that there's going to be any new development. This is going to be exactly the same pattern which has been for the last a few years.
You mentioned that the Chinese government and Russia have suggested this double freeze. We know that that's been rejected by the South and by the United States as well. But now that sanctions have been passed, do you expect that this missile launch will be treated any differently by the international community? It seems that this is different from regular saber rattling, especially since the U.S. wants tougher sanctions, and especially since this is the second test that has gone over Japanese territory, and also given the fact that there's a lot of evidence on the ground that suggests that a hydrogen bomb size explosion has been gone off in the country. Lots to cover here. Is this just going to be more of the same? I mean, can it be more of the same?
I personally, of course, this is all my wish, but I think that at this time, actually, people who have been calling for diplomacy, especially supporting proposals such as the double freeze, they are going to say enough is enough. And this is really, I think this is a really critical moment when